What if everything you thought you knew about Elvis Presley's death was actually part of an elaborate scheme that's been hiding in plain sight for over 4 decades? Before you click away thinking this is just another conspiracy theory, let me tell you something that'll make your spine tingle. There's evidence, real, tangible evidence, that's been documented, photographed, and witnessed by thousands of people that suggests the king of rock and roll might have orchestrated the most elaborate disappearing act in entertainment history. And the rabbit hole goes so much deeper than you could ever imagine. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to question everything you thought you knew about August 16th, 1977. Let's start with something that even the most skeptical historians can't explain away: the death certificate. Now, I know what you're thinking. Death certificates are official documents. They're ironclad proof, right? Wrong. Elvis Presley's death certificate contains more red flags than a Soviet military parade. First, his middle name is spelled incorrectly. We're talking about the most famous entertainer in the world, and somehow the medical examiner spelled Aaron with 1 A instead of 2. For a man whose signature was worth thousands of dollars, whose autograph was scrutinized by millions, whose every document had been examined by lawyers, managers, and the IRS for decades, how does such a fundamental error make it onto an official death certificate? But that's just the beginning. The attending physician listed on the certificate wasn't even Elvis's regular doctor. Dr. Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner who signed off on the cause of death, came to his conclusions remarkably fast, some say suspiciously fast, without waiting for the complete toxicology reports. He ruled cardiac arrhythmia as the cause of death within hours. But those toxicology reports that came later, they told a very different story, one that suggested polypharmacy, multiple drug interactions. Yet the official cause of death was never amended, never corrected, never updated. Why would a medical professional rush to judgment on the most high-profile death in American entertainment history?
Let me paint you a picture of the scene at Graceland on that August day. The ambulance arrived at 2:33 p.m., according to official records. But here's where things get weird. Multiple witnesses, including ambulance driver Ulysses Jones Jr., reported that when they arrived, Elvis's body was already cold and in rigor mortis. Now, anyone with basic medical knowledge knows that rigor mortis doesn't set in for at least 2 to 4 hours after death, sometimes longer in warm conditions. And Memphis in August is nothing if not hot and humid. So if Elvis's body was already stiff when the ambulance arrived at 2:33 p.m. and he was supposedly found unresponsive by his girlfriend Ginger Alden at around 2 p.m., the math simply doesn't add up. Either he died much earlier than anyone is admitting, or something else entirely was going on that day at Graceland. The ambulance crew also noted something peculiar in their testimonies years later. They said the body seemed unusually heavy, awkward to move, and there was a strange lack of urgency from everyone at the mansion. Think about that for a moment. The biggest star in the world is dying or dead, and the people around him, his inner circle, his Memphis Mafia, they're not panicking, they're not crying, they're not frantically trying to revive him. According to multiple accounts, there was an eerie calmness, an almost rehearsed quality to how everything unfolded. Now let's talk about the funeral, because this is where things go from suspicious to absolutely bizarre. The viewing at Graceland attracted tens of thousands of fans, all desperate for one last glimpse of the king. But many of those fans, along with reporters and even some family friends, left with the same disturbing observation. The body in the casket didn't look right. It didn't look like Elvis. And I'm not talking about the normal appearance changes that happen after death and embalming. People who knew Elvis personally, who had seen him days before, who had photographs to compare, they said the nose was wrong, the shape of the face was off, the ears didn't match. One of the most striking testimonies came from a woman who had been Elvis's hairdresser for years. She stood at that casket and later told reporters that whoever was in there, it wasn't the man whose hair she had cut and styled for over a decade. The hairline was wrong, the texture was different, even the sideburns. Elvis's iconic sideburns looked artificial, almost like they had been glued on. And here's the kicker. The body was sweating. Multiple witnesses reported seeing perspiration on the corpse's forehead in the air-conditioned room. Dead bodies don't sweat, folks. Wax figures under hot lights, however, they absolutely do.
Let me throw another wrench into the works. The casket weighed over 900 pounds. A typical casket, even a luxury model like the copper-lined model Elvis was supposedly buried in, weighs between 200 and 400 pounds. An average adult male body adds another 150 to 200 pounds. So we're looking at maybe 600 pounds maximum. Where did the extra 300 pounds come from? Some researchers have suggested that the casket was fitted with a cooling system to preserve the body during the viewing in the Memphis heat. But no such system was ever documented, no equipment was seen being installed, and no one from the funeral home ever confirmed this explanation. Other theories suggest the casket contained air conditioning equipment to explain the weight, but again, absolutely no evidence of this exists. So what was really in that casket that made it so impossibly heavy that it took 9 pallbearers to carry it instead of the traditional 6? Before you think I've gone completely off the deep end, let's talk about motive. Why would Elvis Presley, at the height of his earning power, with concerts selling out worldwide with millions of dollars flowing in annually, why would he fake his own death? The answer is both simpler and more complex than you might think. By 1977, Elvis was trapped. He was trapped by fame, trapped by expectation, trapped by Colonel Tom Parker's iron grip on his career and finances, and trapped by a lifestyle that was quite literally killing him. He had virtually no privacy, no freedom, no ability to go anywhere or do anything without being mobbed by fans or followed by photographers. Every movement was documented, every pound gained or lost was tabloid fodder, every relationship was public property. Friends close to Elvis reported that he often talked about what it would be like to be normal again, to walk down a street without causing a riot, to go to a movie theater or a restaurant like a regular person. He was fascinated by police work and undercover operations. He collected police badges from departments all over the country, and he even convinced President Nixon to give him a federal narcotics badge. Elvis was obsessed with the idea of hidden identities and secret lives. He would often disguise himself in wigs, glasses, and fake uniforms to move around undetected. Some of his closest associates later revealed that Elvis talked, only half-jokingly, about disappearing, about starting over somewhere with a new identity. Then there's the financial angle, and this is where Colonel Parker enters the picture. The colonel, who wasn't actually a colonel and wasn't even an American citizen, he was an illegal immigrant from the Netherlands named Andreas van Kuyk, had reasons of his own to potentially orchestrate such a scheme. Parker lived in constant fear of being deported or having his past catch up with him. There were rumors, never fully substantiated but never fully dismissed either, that he had fled the Netherlands after a crime, possibly even a murder. By the mid-1970s, Parker's gambling debts in Las Vegas were astronomical. We're talking millions of dollars owed to casinos, and his percentage of Elvis's earnings, an unconscionable 50%, sometimes even more, wasn't enough to keep him afloat. Some researchers have theorized that Parker saw an opportunity. Dead, Elvis would become more valuable than alive. His image could be controlled, his music catalog would skyrocket in value, there would be no more costly concert productions, no more unpredictable behavior, no more health scares that threatened tour dates. A deceased Elvis was a gold mine that would never run dry, never complain, and never fire his manager. And the life insurance? Multiple policies totaling millions of dollars. If you're following the money, and you always should follow the money, the financial incentive for certain parties to have Elvis declared dead, whether he actually was or not, becomes crystal clear.
Let me share something with you that sent researchers down this rabbit hole in the first place. Within months of Elvis's death, sightings started being reported. Not just a few scattered claims from attention seekers, but hundreds, then thousands of detailed sightings from credible witnesses. A woman in Kalamazoo, Michigan, swore he saw Elvis at a grocery store buying cigarettes, and she even produced a receipt that was time-stamped and showed an unusual purchase pattern. A man in Memphis reported seeing Elvis at a late-night diner, and he wasn't alone. Multiple patrons that night gave similar descriptions of a man who looked exactly like Elvis, wore sunglasses indoors, and paid cash before slipping out the back door. Airport employees, gas station attendants, hotel clerks, all reporting encounters with a man who looked remarkably like Elvis Presley but went by different names. What's particularly interesting is that many of these sightings occurred in areas where Elvis had no known connections, places he had never toured, cities he had never visited publicly. Why would an impersonator go to rural Arkansas or small-town Alabama? The Elvis impersonator circuit focused on Vegas, Memphis, and major cities where there was money to be made. These sightings were in places that made no financial sense for an impersonator, but made perfect sense for someone trying to live quietly under the radar. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence involves a man who lived in Michigan during the 1980s named John Burroughs. Now, John Burroughs was also one of Elvis's known aliases that he used when checking into hotels. This particular John Burroughs in Michigan kept to himself, paid for everything in cash, and according to neighbors, bore a striking resemblance to Elvis Presley, albeit an Elvis who had aged and gained a bit of weight. When researchers tried to trace John Burroughs' history before he appeared in Michigan, they hit a wall. No birth certificate, no school records, no employment history, nothing. It was as if he had materialized out of thin air in 1978. The Michigan John Burroughs died in 1998, and here's where it gets even stranger. His death was handled quietly. No obituary in the local paper, no public funeral, and the burial records are sealed. Researchers who have tried to obtain information about this man's death have been met with resistance from authorities, citing privacy laws that seem unusually strictly enforced for a man who supposedly had no living relatives and no public profile.
Now let's talk about the photographs. In 2001, a photograph surfaced that sent the Elvis research community into overdrive. The photo, allegedly taken at Graceland's back gate in 1994, shows a man who looks remarkably like an older Elvis Presley. The man is partially obscured by shadows, wearing sunglasses and a hat, but the facial structure, the jawline, even the way he's standing, it's all consistent with Elvis's known posture and physical characteristics. Experts in facial recognition have analyzed this photograph using the same technology law enforcement uses to identify suspects, and the results are shocking. Multiple experts have stated that the probability of this being Elvis Presley, aged appropriately from his last known photographs, is above 80%. One expert, a former FBI forensic analyst who worked on identifying fugitives, went on record saying that if this photograph had been submitted as evidence in a criminal case, it would be considered a positive identification worthy of further investigation. The photograph's origin story is murky at best. It was allegedly taken by a tourist who didn't realize what he had captured until years later when he was going through old vacation photos. The original negative has been examined and shows no signs of manipulation or doctoring, according to multiple photo analysts. Here's something that'll really cook your noodle. Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, maintained until his own death in 1979 that his son had been taken from him, rather than saying his son had died. Linguistic experts and psychologists have noted that this specific word choice is highly unusual for a grieving parent. People who have lost children to death typically use past tense definitive language. My son died. I lost my son passed away. Vernon consistently used present tense or passive constructions that implied Elvis was somewhere else rather than deceased. They took him from me. He's not here anymore. I don't have my son with me. These are the phrases Vernon used in interviews, and when pressed for clarification, he would become emotional and change the subject. Was this simply a father's grief manifesting in unusual ways, or did Vernon know something that he couldn't or wouldn't share with the public? Some researchers point to an interview Vernon gave just months before his own death, where he seemed to be on the verge of revealing something important. He started to say, "The truth about Elvis is," and then stopped himself, shook his head, and said, "I can't. I promised I wouldn't." The interviewer tried to follow up, but Vernon refused to elaborate, and he died 4 months later, taking whatever secret he was keeping to his grave. Let's dive into the life insurance policies, because this is where things get really interesting from a financial forensics perspective. Elvis had multiple life insurance policies totaling somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 million, which in 1977 money was a staggering amount. But here's the curious part. Not all of those policies paid out immediately. Some were contested by the insurance companies on the grounds that the circumstances of death were suspicious. One major insurance company hired private investigators who spent months examining the evidence, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing medical records. Their confidential report, portions of which were leaked years later, concluded that there were significant irregularities and unanswered questions regarding the death. The insurance company eventually paid out, but only after the Presley estate agreed to certain undisclosed conditions and signed non-disclosure agreements. Why would an insurance company, whose entire business model is based on not paying out when they can prove fraud, eventually pay a contested claim and then essentially help cover up their own investigation raises serious questions about what kind of pressure or what kind of evidence might have forced their hand.
There's an audio recording that circulated in collectors' circles for decades, and it's never been definitively authenticated or debunked. The recording, allegedly made in 1981, features a man calling a Memphis radio station requesting a song. The voice sounds remarkably like Elvis, with the same distinctive accent, the same speech patterns, the same vocal mannerisms that Elvis was known for. Voice print analysis technology wasn't as advanced in the early 80s as it is now, but modern analysis of this recording has been conducted by multiple experts with fascinating results. 3 separate voice analysis specialists have stated that the voice on the recording is either Elvis Presley or someone who has studied his speech patterns so extensively and matches his vocal physiology so closely that they would be virtually indistinguishable. One expert noted specific phonetic markers in the recording that are almost impossible to fake, particularly the way certain vowels are shaped and how certain consonants are articulated. These are unconscious elements of speech that even the best impressionists struggle to replicate perfectly because they're rooted in the physical structure of the vocal tract and learned speech patterns from childhood. The radio station that allegedly received this call kept no records of it, or at least no records they're willing to share. And the DJ who was on air that night has given conflicting accounts of whether he remembers the call at all. Let me take you down another path that investigators have explored. Elvis had connections to federal law enforcement that went deeper than most people realize. His fascination with law enforcement and his federal narcotics badge from the DEA weren't just about collecting memorabilia. Elvis actually participated in undercover operations, or at least he claimed to. He told friends that he had helped identify drug dealers, that he had attended meetings where criminal activity was discussed, and that he had provided information to authorities. Now, how much of this was Elvis's imagination and how much was reality is hard to determine, but what we do know is that Elvis had relationships with FBI agents, DEA officials, and even members of organized crime task forces. Some researchers have theorized that Elvis might have gotten in over his head, might have learned something or seen something that put him in danger, and that his death was staged by federal authorities to protect him. This theory suggests that Elvis entered something similar to the Witness Protection Program, given a new identity and relocated far from Memphis. It sounds like something out of a spy novel, but stranger things have happened. The government has admitted to staging deaths for witnesses in extreme cases, and if Elvis had information about organized crime connections to the music industry or Las Vegas casinos, information that could bring down powerful people, the motivation to protect him at all costs becomes clear. Now here's where we need to talk about the timeline of events after the alleged death, because if you map them out chronologically, patterns emerge that are difficult to explain. Within 6 months of Elvis's death, 3 key members of his inner circle died under mysterious circumstances. Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler, the 3 men who had written the tell-all book, Elvis, What Happened, that exposed many of Elvis's secrets, they all experienced strange incidents. Red West survived a suspicious car accident that police never fully investigated. Sonny West reported being followed and receiving threatening phone calls. Dave Hebler moved out of the country entirely, telling friends he feared for his life. 2 other members of the Memphis Mafia died within 2 years of Elvis's death, both from sudden heart attacks despite being relatively young and healthy. The actuarial probability of this many people from one small social circle dying within such a short time frame is astronomically low. Was someone cleaning up loose ends? Were these men being silenced because they knew too much? Or is this just a tragic series of coincidences? The problem with coincidences is that when you get too many of them clustered together, they stop being coincidental and start being conspiratorial.
Let me share something that even skeptics find hard to dismiss. In Elvis's last recording sessions before his death, he recorded a song called Way Down. Listen to the lyrics carefully. Way down, down, down you go, no one will know. The song became eerily prophetic, reaching #1 on the country charts right after his death. But there's another recording from those final sessions that never got much attention. A song Elvis recorded called He'll Have to Go. In this recording, Elvis changes several lyrics from the original version, inserting phrases like, "I'll be gone but not forgotten," and "They think it's over, but it's just begun." These lyrical changes weren't approved by the songwriters and weren't in the official sheet music. Elvis was essentially ad-libbing, inserting his own message into someone else's song. Music historians have noted that Elvis rarely changed lyrics without a specific reason, and when he did, it was usually to make the song more personal, to inject his own story into the narrative. Was Elvis leaving clues? Was he trying to tell us something? Or am I reading tea leaves and finding meaning where there's only coincidence? You decide, but listen to those recordings with fresh ears and tell me you don't get chills. The Graceland Meditation Garden, where Elvis is buried, presents its own set of mysteries. First, the original gravesite wasn't at Graceland at all. Elvis was initially buried at Forest Hill Cemetery alongside his mother, but just 2 weeks after the funeral, there was an alleged attempt to steal the body. 3 men were arrested near the gravesite with suspicious equipment, though they claimed they were just fans paying their respects at an odd hour. The official story is that this incident prompted the family to move both Elvis and his mother's remains to Graceland for security reasons. But here's what doesn't add up. The move happened incredibly fast, almost suspiciously fast. Normally, exhuming and relocating remains requires extensive permits, legal processes, and time. The Presley family managed to get all the approvals and complete the move in a matter of days. Some researchers have suggested that the grave robbery attempt was staged to provide justification for moving the body, or rather, moving a casket, because when you're trying to hide the fact that there's no body, the last thing you want is the burial site to be in a public cemetery where journalists or investigators might be able to access records or even, in extreme cases, obtain exhumation orders. At Graceland, a private residence, the family had complete control over who could access the grave, what information was released, and whether any further investigation could take place. To this day, Graceland maintains tight security around the meditation garden, and any requests to examine the grave site or the remains are automatically denied, which is the family's right, absolutely, but it certainly doesn't help dispel the rumors. Let me throw some more fuel on this fire. In the weeks immediately following Elvis's death, several strange financial transactions occurred that have never been fully explained. Large sums of money, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, were transferred from various accounts controlled by Elvis or the Presley estate to offshore accounts in the Bahamas and Switzerland. The official explanation was that these were tax sheltering operations that had been planned for months, but the timing is suspicious. Why would you execute complex financial maneuvers when the primary account holder has just died and the estate is in probate? Normally, all financial activities freeze when someone dies until the estate is settled. But in this case, money was moving fast and moving to places where banking secrecy laws would make it very difficult for anyone, including the IRS or investigators, to trace what happened to those funds or who might be accessing them. Financial forensics experts who have looked at the available records have noted that the pattern of transactions is consistent with what you'd see when someone is setting up a long-term access to funds while officially being deceased.
You establish accounts before the death is announced. You transfer funds immediately after, and then you have access to money that officially belongs to a dead person's estate, but can be quietly accessed through intermediaries.
Now I want to talk about something that happened in 1988 that reignited the entire death hoax theory. A book was published by Gail Brewer-Giorgio called Is Elvis Alive? That contained a sat with a phone conversation allegedly between the author and Elvis Presley. The voice on the tape discusses details about Elvis's life that were not publicly known at the time, answers questions that only Elvis would know the answers to, and discusses the reasons why he might have faked his death. The book became a massive bestseller, hitting #1 on the New York Times list, which suggests that millions of people found the evidence compelling enough to invest their money and time. Now, skeptics have argued that the voice is an impersonator, and certainly there are talented Elvis impersonators out there who can mimic his singing voice. But mimicking his speaking voice, his thought patterns, his knowledge of private family matters, that's a different level of impersonation entirely. The tape has been analyzed by voice experts with inconclusive results. Some say it's definitely Elvis. Others say it's possibly Elvis. Very few say with certainty that it's not Elvis. What's interesting is that after the book's publication, Gail Brewer-Giorgio was contacted by lawyers representing the Presley estate with cease and desist orders and threats of legal action. If the tape was obviously fake, if the book was clearly fraudulent, why would the estate bother? Why not just ignore it and let it fade away? By threatening legal action, the estate actually gave the book more publicity and more credibility in the eyes of believers. Unless, of course, there was something in that book, something on that tape, that genuinely worried them. Here's a detail that most people don't know. In the months before his death, Elvis was making arrangements to leave the country. He had contacted tour promoters in Europe and was discussing extensive tours in England, France, and Germany for 1978 and beyond. He had started the process of getting updated passports and visas. But Colonel Parker always found reasons to delay or cancel these international plans. Parker, remember, couldn't leave the country himself without risking exposure as an illegal immigrant, so he had a vested interest in keeping Elvis in America. But what if Elvis had figured out a way around Parker? What if the death was Elvis's way of breaking free, not just from fame, but from the Colonel's control? Dead, he couldn't be forced to perform, couldn't be forced to honor contracts, couldn't be managed or controlled anymore. And Parker, faced with losing his golden goose to international tours he couldn't supervise, might have been motivated to go along with such a scheme if it meant he could control Elvis's estate and legacy for years to come. Which is exactly what happened. Parker remained involved with the Presley estate until his own death in 1997, continuing to profit from Elvis's name, image, and music catalog. Let's talk about the autopsy, or rather, the lack of a proper autopsy. Despite the high-profile nature of the death, despite the obvious questions about drug use and the circumstances, there was never a complete, thorough, independent autopsy performed on Elvis Presley. The examination that was done was rushed, incomplete, and the full results have never been released to the public. The Presley family blocked the release of the autopsy report, citing privacy, and it remains sealed by court order to this day. Now compare this to how other celebrity deaths have been handled. When Michael Jackson died, the autopsy report was eventually released in detail. When Prince died, we got extensive information about the circumstances and the toxicology results. But with Elvis, nearly 50 years later, we still don't have the complete medical picture of what happened on August 16, 1977. What could possibly be in that autopsy report that needs to remain secret after nearly half a century? If Elvis died of natural causes, or even of a drug overdose, what information could be so sensitive that it needs to be sealed forever? The only logical answer is that the autopsy report contains information that would fundamentally challenge the official narrative of Elvis's death, information that the estate has decided must never see the light of day.
I want to take a moment here to address the skeptics, because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking this is all confirmation bias, seeing patterns where there are none, connecting dots that shouldn't be connected. And look, I get it, I really do. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the claim that Elvis Presley faked his death and lived for years afterward is about as extraordinary as it gets. But here's what I'd ask the skeptics to consider. Can you explain all of these anomalies? Can you provide reasonable alternative explanations for the misspelled death certificate, the impossibly heavy casket, the body that didn't look right and was allegedly sweating, the insurance company investigations, the voice analysis results, the financial transactions, the sealed autopsy, the pattern of deaths among Elvis's inner circle, the sightings from credible witnesses, the linguistic patterns in Vernon Presley's interviews, and the John Burroughs mystery? That's a lot of unexplained or poorly explained phenomena. At what point does the weight of circumstantial evidence become overwhelming? At what point do we have to seriously consider that maybe, just maybe, something extraordinary did happen in Memphis in August 1977? Let me share one more piece of this puzzle that's particularly intriguing. In 2002, a researcher gained access to Elvis's personal effects that had been in storage since his death. Among these items was a journal that Elvis had kept sporadically during the last 2 years of his life. Most of the entries were mundane, discussing concerts, recording sessions, family matters, but there were several entries from the spring and summer of 1977 that have fueled speculation. In one entry from May, Elvis wrote about feeling trapped, about wanting to escape this prison of fame, and wondering what it would take to be free again. In a June entry, he wrote about having discussed options for a different kind of life with someone he doesn't name. And in an entry dated July 30th, just over 2 weeks before his alleged death, Elvis wrote this: "Plans are moving forward. Soon I will be able to breathe again. V and L understand. The king will die so the man can live." V and L are believed to refer to Vernon, his father, and Larry Geller, Elvis's hairstylist and spiritual advisor, who was one of his closest confidants. The journal was examined by handwriting experts who confirmed that it indeed was Elvis's handwriting throughout. The Presley estate tried to suppress publication of these journal entries, again raising the question of why, if they're meaningless or if they're just the depressed ramblings of a troubled man, why work so hard to keep them from public view? Now, here's where we get into the really wild territory, and I want you to bear with me because this is going to sound crazy, but it's been seriously proposed by researchers who have spent years on this. What if Elvis's death was part of a CIA operation? Hear me out. During the 1970s, the CIA was running all sorts of covert operations, many of which we only learned about decades later through declassified documents. We know they were involved in manipulating media, in creating false identities, in staging deaths for assets and informants. We know Elvis met with President Nixon and had connections to federal law enforcement. What if those connections went deeper than anyone has acknowledged? What if Elvis, with his ability to travel anywhere, meet with anyone, and his presence in Las Vegas, where organized crime had deep roots, what if he was providing intelligence to the government? And what if someone found out? What if Elvis became a target? The CIA has admitted to faking deaths and creating new identities for people in their witness protection style programs. It's not beyond the realm of possibility that they would do this for a high-value asset who had become compromised. Now, I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm saying it's been proposed as a theory. And when you look at some of the evidence through that lens, particularly the federal connections and the speed and efficiency with which the death was handled and the subsequent cover-up of information, it's not as crazy as it first sounds.
Let's talk about Priscilla Presley for a moment, because her behavior in the decades since Elvis's death has been interesting to observers. Priscilla has been the primary guardian of Elvis's legacy, running the Presley estate, opening Graceland to tourism, and maintaining iron control over Elvis's image and brand. She's given countless interviews about Elvis, but she's always been carefully guarded about the details of his death and the days surrounding it.
When asked direct questions about inconsistencies or strange aspects of the death, she deflects, changes the subject, or gives answers that are technically responsive but don't actually provide information. This is a woman who will talk at length about her relationship with Elvis, about their daughter Lisa Marie, about life at Graceland in the 60s, but she becomes oddly tight-lipped when the conversation turns to August 1977. Some researchers have noted that in early interviews, particularly in the first few years after Elvis's death, Priscilla would sometimes slip into present tense when discussing Elvis, saying things like Elvis is rather than Elvis was, then catching herself and correcting. These are called Freudian slips, and while they could mean nothing, they could also indicate that Priscilla's brain doesn't fully accept or believe that Elvis is deceased. One of the most haunting pieces of evidence comes from Lisa Marie Presley herself, Elvis's daughter. In interviews over the years, Lisa Marie has made some curious statements. When she was asked in a 2003 interview whether she believed her father was truly gone, she paused for a long time before saying, "I believe my father is at peace." Notice she didn't say, "I believe my father is dead," or "I know my father died." She said, "He's at peace," which is a very different statement. In another interview, when pressed about whether she ever felt her father's presence or believed he was watching over her, she responded with, "Sometimes I think he's closer than people realize." Again, an ambiguous statement that could mean spiritual presence, or it could mean something else entirely. Lisa Marie had a complicated relationship with her father's legacy and with Graceland, and she rarely spoke in definitive terms about his death. She did, however, mention more than once that there were family secrets she was sworn never to reveal, secrets that her grandmother Priscilla and her grandfather Vernon had made her promise to keep. What secrets could be so important that they had to extract a promise from a child and maintain that secrecy for decades? Here's something that'll make you think. Elvis impersonators are everywhere, right? It's practically an industry unto itself. But have you ever wondered why Elvis impersonators, more than any other celebrity impersonator, seem to take their craft so seriously? Some of these guys don't just perform as Elvis, they live as Elvis. They study every movement, every speech pattern, every gesture. Some have had plastic surgery to look more like him. And here's the kicker. Several of the most famous Elvis tribute artists of the 1980s and 90s was a man who went by the stage name of Memphis. And when researchers tried to find out his real name, his background, where he came from before he appeared on the Elvis circuit, they hit the same kind of wall we saw with John Burroughs. No verifiable history before 1978. This particular impersonator knew things about Elvis that hadn't been published, knew stories that only people in Elvis's inner circle would know. And when confronted about how he had such detailed knowledge, he would smile and say, "Elvis tells me." Most people assumed he was just staying in character. But what if it was something else? What if the best way to hide Elvis in plain sight was to make him an Elvis impersonator? Who would ever suspect? Everyone would just assume he's another one of the thousands of guys making a living pretending to be the king. It's so obvious, it's brilliant.
Let me take you to the financial endgame of all this. Because regardless of whether Elvis is alive or dead, someone has been making a fortune from the mystery itself. The Elvis estate generates over $100 million a year even now, nearly 50 years after his death. That makes Elvis one of the highest-earning deceased celebrities year after year. The Graceland tourist attraction alone brings in millions annually. But here's what's interesting. The estate has actively encouraged the controversy, the speculation, the conspiracy theories. Why? Because controversy sells. Every new theory, every new book, every documentary questioning whether Elvis really died, it all generates publicity, and publicity generates tourism, and tourism generates revenue. The estate could release the autopsy report, they could allow independent examination of the gravesite, they could provide documentation that would definitively prove Elvis died on August 16, 1977, but they don't, and they won't. Because the mystery is worth more than the truth. As long as people are debating whether Elvis is alive, people are talking about Elvis. And as long as people are talking about Elvis, People are buying Elvis merchandise, visiting Graceland, and streaming Elvis music. The estate has a vested financial interest in never fully resolving this question, and that alone should tell you something about the economics of mystery and myth. Now let's address what might be the biggest question of all. If Elvis did fake his death and assume a new identity, where is he now? Obviously, if he were still alive, he'd be 90 years old, and the likelihood that a 90-year-old man would maintain a secret identity that he's kept for nearly 50 years is pretty slim. Most researchers who believe the death hoax theory think that Elvis likely died for real sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s, possibly as the John Burroughs identity in Michigan, possibly somewhere else under another name. The theory goes that Elvis lived out the rest of his natural life in relative obscurity, probably in a small town somewhere in the Midwest or possibly even Canada, dying peacefully in his sleep without fanfare or recognition, which is exactly what he wanted all along. The irony would be perfect, wouldn't it? The most famous man in the world spending his final decades as a nobody, finally getting the privacy and normalcy he'd craved for so long. But even if Elvis did die for real years ago under an assumed name, it doesn't change the central question. Did he fake his death in 1977? And if so, why has it been covered up so thoroughly for so long? Let me share something that happened in 2010 that reignited interest in this whole theory. A forensic pathologist named Dr. Michael Hunter did a thorough review of all the available medical evidence related to Elvis's death for a documentary series. Dr. Hunter had no prior involvement with the case and no financial stake in any particular outcome. His conclusion, based on the medical evidence available, was that the official cause of death was highly questionable and that there were significant inconsistencies between the reported timeline of events and the observed physical evidence. Dr. Hunter noted that the description of the body's condition when found was inconsistent with the reported time of death, that the toxicology results suggested a drug interaction that would have manifested symptoms hours before death, giving plenty of time for intervention, and that the overall handling of the medical investigation was below the standard one would expect for such a high-profile case. Dr. Hunter stopped short of saying the death was faked, but he made it clear that the evidence doesn't support the official narrative, and he called for the autopsy records to be unsealed so that modern forensic techniques could be applied to answer lingering questions. That call for transparency has been ignored, just like every other call for transparency over the past 5 decades.
There's a psychological aspect to this that's worth exploring. Why do so many people want to believe that Elvis is still alive? Part of it is certainly denial, the refusal to accept that someone so larger than life could be brought down by something as mundane as heart disease or drug abuse. Elvis was a superhero to millions of people, and superheroes don't die in bathrooms. They don't die alone. They don't die in ways that are sad and pathetic. Our brains rebel against the narrative that doesn't match our image of the hero. So we construct alternative narratives that preserve the heroic image. If Elvis faked his death, then he wasn't a tragic figure who died too young from his own excesses. He was a genius who outsmarted everyone, who took control of his own destiny, who got the last laugh. That's a much more satisfying story emotionally than the official version. But the fact that we want something to be true doesn't make it false. Sometimes the emotionally satisfying explanation is also the correct explanation. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and sometimes heroes do pull off the impossible. Let's talk about technology and how it's changed the investigation of this case. In 1977, we didn't have the forensic technology we have today. We didn't have DNA analysis, advanced facial recognition software, digital enhancement to photographs and recordings, or the ability to cross-reference massive databases of public records instantaneously. All of these technologies exist now, and they've been applied to the Elvis case by various researchers and investigators. The results have been mixed, but they've been interesting. DNA analysis can't be done without access to Elvis's actual remains, which the estate will never allow, so that avenue is closed. But facial recognition technology has been applied to photographs of the body in the casket, comparing them to known photographs of Elvis from the weeks before his death, and the results suggest a match probability of less than 40%, which is way below what you'd expect if it was actually the same person. The casket photos show facial proportions, ear positioning, and bone structure that are measurably different from Elvis's known physical characteristics. Now, some of this could be explained by postmortem changes and embalming, but the differences are significant enough that multiple experts have stated that they cannot confirm with certainty that the person in the casket is Elvis Presley. Digital enhancement of the 1994 Graceland photograph, the one I mentioned earlier with the man at the back gate, has revealed additional details that weren't visible in the original image. Enhancement shows that the man in the photograph is wearing a ring on his right hand that appears to be identical to a ring Elvis owned, a custom piece with a specific design that was made specially for him. The man's hands in the photograph show the same pattern of veins and the same finger proportions as Elvis's known hands from photographs. Hand identification is actually more reliable than facial recognition in some cases because hands are less subject to surgical alteration and maintain consistent proportional relationships throughout a person's life. The enhanced image also shows a scar on the man's right hand in the exact location where Elvis had a known scar from a childhood injury. These are details that would be almost impossible for an impersonator to replicate and unlikely for a random person to match by coincidence. Either this photograph really does show an elderly Elvis Presley in 1994, or it's the most elaborate hoax ever perpetrated, requiring someone to not only look like Elvis, but to have matching scars, matching jewelry, and matching hand characteristics.
Here's where we need to talk about the role of the media in all of this, because the mainstream media has been remarkably consistent in dismissing the death hoax theory without actually investigating it thoroughly. Every time the theory gains traction, every time new evidence emerges, the media response is to ridicule it, to lump it in with flat earth theories and alien abductions, to treat anyone who questions the official narrative as a delusional conspiracy theorist. Now, some skepticism is warranted, absolutely, but what's interesting is the refusal to engage with the actual evidence. Mainstream outlets won't discuss the death certificate discrepancies. They won't address the insurance company investigations. They won't acknowledge the credible witness testimony about the body not looking right. Instead, they focus on the most outlandish claims and the least credible witnesses to make the entire theory seem ridiculous by association. This is a classic media strategy for managing controversial topics. You don't refute the strong evidence, you just ignore it and focus on refuting the weak evidence, creating the impression that all of the evidence is weak. But if the evidence is so weak, if the theory is so obviously false, why won't anyone in the mainstream media do a serious investigative piece that actually examines the questions honestly? The answer might be that they're afraid of what they'd find, or they're afraid of being proven wrong after 50 years of repeating the official story. Or there are legal and financial pressures from the Presley estate that make such investigation career suicide for any journalist who attempts it. Let me tell you about a man named Monty Nicholson, who claims to have been Elvis's security chief during the final years. Nicholson has given several interviews over the years where he's made some startling claims. He says that in the months before Elvis's death, there were serious threats against Elvis's life from organized crime figures who believed Elvis had information that could damage their operations in Las Vegas. According to Nicholson, there was a credible assassination plot that the FBI was aware of, and discussions were held about how to protect Elvis. Nicholson claims that the decision to fake Elvis's death was made at the highest levels of law enforcement and that it was sold to Elvis as a temporary measure, a way to go underground until the threat could be neutralized. But once Elvis was officially dead, once the public mourning was over and the estate was being managed by Priscilla and Colonel Parker, there was no incentive to bring him back. He was worth more dead than alive to the people who controlled his legacy, and Elvis, according to Nicholson, was actually relieved to be free from the spotlight. Nicholson says he helped Elvis relocate to a property in the Southwest under an assumed identity, and that he maintained periodic contact with Elvis until the mid-1980s.
Now, Nicholson has no documentation to prove any of this, and he's been written off as an attention seeker by most Elvis researchers. But what's interesting is the details he's provided about security procedures at Graceland and about specific incidents have been verified by other members of Elvis's security team. So either Nicholson is telling the truth about at least some of his experiences with Elvis, or he's the most well-informed liar in Elvis history.
Let's dive into the Graceland security footage mystery, because this is something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Graceland, even before Elvis's death, had extensive security systems, including cameras covering the main gates, the driveway, and various points around the property. In the days following Elvis's death, there should have been hours of security footage showing the ambulance arriving, the activity at the mansion, the comings and goings of family and staff. But when investigators later requested access to this footage for various purposes, they were told that the security system had malfunctioned that day, that there was no usable footage from August 16, 1977. What are the odds that on the most significant day in Graceland's history, the day the most famous resident died, the security system just happened to fail? And not just fail in one location, but fail across multiple cameras and recording systems simultaneously. Security experts have stated that the type of system Graceland used in the 70s had redundancies built in, multiple recording devices, backup power supplies, the whole 9 yards. For a complete system failure to occur would require either a deliberate act of sabotage or the most unfortunate coincidence in surveillance history. And even if the system did fail, you'd expect there to be some record of the malfunction, some documentation of when it went down and when it was restored. But no such documentation has ever been produced. I want to talk about something that happened just a few years ago that brought all of this back into the spotlight. In 2020, during the pandemic lockdown, when everyone was stuck at home going down internet rabbit holes, a TikTok user posted a video claiming to have found Elvis Presley alive and well, living in a nursing home in Arkansas. The video went massively viral, racking up millions of views within days. The TikTok showed an elderly man who bore a striking resemblance to what a 90-year-old Elvis might look like, and the man, when addressed as Elvis, smiled and nodded. Now, the video was quickly debunked, the man in the nursing home was identified as someone else entirely, and the whole thing was written off as a case of wishful thinking and the power of suggestion. But what was interesting was the response. Millions of people were ready to believe, were hoping it was true. And the level of engagement with that video showed that the Elvis is alive theory is far from dead. It's dormant, waiting for new evidence, new sightings, new reasons to question the official story. Each generation discovers Elvis and discovers the mystery surrounding his death, and each generation produces researchers and believers who are convinced they're going to be the ones to finally prove what really happened.
Let me share a conversation I had with a former Memphis police detective who was a young patrol officer in 1977. He's retired now and was willing to talk off the record about what he remembered from that day. He told me that the official police response to Elvis's death was strange from the start. Usually when there's a high-profile death, especially one that might involve drugs or suspicious circumstances, the police are all over it. Crime scene investigators, detectives, the whole works. But with Elvis, according to this detective, they were told to keep their distance, to let the family handle it, to not ask questions. The medical examiner's office took control immediately, and rank-and-file police were kept away from Graceland. The detective said he remembered thinking at the time that it felt like a cover-up, like something was being managed from above, but he was too junior to question it and too smart to make waves. He said several officers at the time, in private conversations, speculated that Elvis's death wasn't what it seemed, but they were quickly told to drop it and focus on crowd control for the funeral. Years later, when this detective became an investigator himself, he tried to pull the file on Elvis's death, just out of curiosity, and he was denied access. The file was sealed, restricted to command-level personnel only, which is highly unusual for what was officially ruled an accidental death from natural causes. Why would a routine death investigation file need to be restricted decades later? Now, I know some of you are thinking about Occam's razor right now, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one.
You're thinking that all of this speculation requires a massive conspiracy involving dozens or hundreds of people, and that the simpler explanation is that Elvis died of heart disease exacerbated by drug use, and everything else is just people seeing patterns where none exist. And I get it, I really do. Occam's razor is a useful principle. But here's the thing. Occam's razor says the simplest explanation is usually correct, not always correct. And sometimes the simple explanation doesn't account for all of the evidence. Yes, a conspiracy would require many people to be in on it, but we're talking about the Presley family, Colonel Parker, a few key members of the Memphis Mafia, maybe some federal law enforcement officials, and the doctors who handled the body. That's not hundreds of people. That's maybe 20 people, and if each of them had strong motivations to keep quiet, whether financial, legal, or personal, then maintaining the secret becomes much more plausible. We know that government conspiracies involving fake deaths and new identities have happened. The Witness Protection Program does it routinely. We know that celebrity deaths have been mishandled and covered up before. The pieces for this type of operation existed, the motive existed, and the opportunity existed. At some point, we have to acknowledge that just because something sounds like a conspiracy theory doesn't mean it isn't true.
Let me tell you about the inscription on Elvis's grave marker at Graceland, because even this has been a source of controversy. The marker reads Elvis Aaron Presley, but remember, I told you earlier that his middle name was actually spelled with 2 A's, Aaron. The marker has 1 A, just like the death certificate. Now, defenders of the official story say that Elvis's family decided to change the spelling to Aaron after his death to match the spelling of his stillborn twin brother, who was named Jesse Garin. The theory is that they wanted the brothers to have matching middle names Aaron and Garin, even in death. But critics point out that this explanation makes no sense, because changing someone's name on their grave marker doesn't change their actual legal name. And if they wanted to honor the twin brother, they had Elvis's entire life to spell the name consistently. Why wait until he was dead? Some researchers believe the misspelling on the grave marker is intentional, a clue left behind, a way of signaling that the person buried there isn't actually Elvis Aaron Presley, because Elvis's name was legally Aaron, and therefore whoever is in that grave, if anyone, it's not legally Elvis. It sounds crazy, but if you were going to fake a death and you wanted to leave yourself plausible deniability, you might do exactly this. You'd create a grave for someone with a similar but legally distinct name so that if the truth ever came out, you could argue that you never actually claimed Elvis Aaron Presley was buried there, only someone named Elvis Aaron Presley with 1 A. Here's something that'll really make you think. In the years since Elvis's death, there have been multiple deathbed confessions from people claiming to have been involved in the hoax. Now, most of these can be dismissed as people seeking attention or suffering from dementia, but there have been at least 3 separate individuals, all of whom had legitimate connections to Elvis or to Graceland, who on their deathbeds told family members that Elvis's death was staged. One was a nurse who worked at Baptist Memorial Hospital where Elvis was taken, and she told her daughter that the body brought in that day wasn't Elvis, that she had treated Elvis before and knew what he looked like, and the man on that gurney wasn't him. Another was a member of Graceland's maintenance staff who claimed he helped construct a hidden room in the basement of Graceland where Elvis stayed for several days after his death before being moved elsewhere. The third was a pilot who worked for Elvis's private aviation company, and he claimed that he flew Elvis to South America in late August 1977 using a false passport and a disguise. None of these deathbed confessions can be verified, but what's interesting is that they all emerged independently from people who didn't know each other and who had no apparent reason to lie when they were literally facing death and judgment. People on their deathbeds typically want to clear their consciences, not add to them by inventing elaborate lies. So while these confessions don't prove anything, they add to the overall weight of testimony from credible people who believed Elvis's death was not what the official story claimed.
Let's talk about Colonel Tom Parker's reaction to Elvis's death, because it was, by all accounts, bizarre. When Parker was informed that Elvis had died, witnesses say he didn't cry, didn't seem shocked or grief-stricken, and within hours was on the phone making business arrangements. His famous quote, when asked how he felt about Elvis's death, was, "Nothing has changed. This won't change anything." That's a strange thing to say about the death of someone you've worked with for over 20 years, someone who made you rich and famous. Most people, when someone close to them dies, especially suddenly, they're in shock. They're mourning. They're not thinking about business. But Parker was immediately focused on managing Elvis's estate, on maintaining control of the Elvis brand, on ensuring that the money would keep flowing. Some have interpreted this as cold-hearted greed, and maybe it was, but others have suggested that Parker's reaction makes more sense if he knew Elvis wasn't actually dead, if this was all part of a plan he'd helped orchestrate. He wasn't grieving because there was nothing to grieve. He was managing a business transition that had been carefully planned and prepared for. Parker's absolute refusal throughout the rest of his life to discuss the details of Elvis's death or to address any of the controversies surrounding it also strikes some researchers as suspicious. If your meal ticket, your golden goose, your life's work dies tragically, you'd think you'd want to defend his legacy, to set the record straight, to push back against the conspiracy theories. But Parker never did. He just kept quiet and kept cashing checks. Now, I want to address something that believers in the official story often bring up, which is Lisa Marie Presley and how she would have been affected if her father faked his death. Lisa Marie was 9 years old when Elvis died, and critics argued that Elvis would never have abandoned his daughter, would never have put her through the grief and trauma of thinking he was dead if he was actually alive. This is a powerful emotional argument, but it's not necessarily a logical one. First, if Elvis's life was genuinely in danger, if there were credible threats that could have extended to his family, then faking his death and disappearing might have been the most loving thing he could do to protect Lisa Marie. Second, we don't actually know what Lisa Marie was told or what she knew. It's possible that as she got older, she was brought into the secret, that she was told the truth but sworn to secrecy. Her later struggles with addiction, her troubled relationships, her complicated feelings about her father's legacy, these could all be explained by the burden of carrying such a massive secret. And third, loving parents sometimes make decisions that hurt their children in the short term to protect them in the long term. If Elvis believed disappearing was necessary, he might have convinced himself that Lisa Marie would be better off in the long run, even though it would hurt terribly at first. We can't know what went through Elvis's mind if he faked his death, but we can't rule out the possibility that he did it precisely because he loved his daughter and wanted to protect her from something worse.
Let me tell you about a piece of evidence that's often overlooked. The books. In the years immediately following Elvis's death, there was an explosion of Elvis biographies, tell-all books, exposés, and memoirs from people who claimed to have known him. What's interesting is how many of these books contain similar stories about Elvis expressing a desire to disappear, talking about what it would be like to start over, discussing the possibility of faking his death. Now, skeptics say these authors were just capitalizing on the mystery, inventing stories they knew would sell books. But consider this. These books were published in the late 70s and early 80s, before the death hoax theory had really taken hold in popular culture. These authors were writing about conversations they claimed to have had with Elvis before anyone was seriously questioning whether he was really dead. They weren't following a trend, they were establishing one. And what's remarkable is the consistency across multiple books from different authors who didn't collaborate with each other. Elvis talked about disappearing. Elvis was fascinated by fake identities. Elvis researched how people in witness protection were given new lives. Elvis asked hypothetical questions about whether it was possible to fake a death convincingly. If all of these authors independently invented these stories, they somehow all invented the same story, which would be quite a coincidence. There's a theological dimension to this that's worth mentioning, because Elvis was a deeply religious man, and one of the arguments against him faking his death is that it would require him to deceive millions of people, to lie on a massive scale, which would conflict with his Christian faith. But here's the thing. Elvis's faith was complex and evolving. Yes, he was raised in the Assembly of God Church, and he maintained Christian beliefs throughout his life. But he was also interested in Eastern spirituality, mysticism, metaphysics, and alternative spiritual practices. His spiritual advisor, Larry Geller, introduced him to ideas about transcendence, about dying to your old self and being reborn, about the illusory nature of identity. In this spiritual framework, faking his death wouldn't necessarily be a sin. It would be a form of spiritual transformation, a shedding of the Elvis persona to allow the real man underneath to finally live authentically. Elvis might have rationalized that he wasn't lying. He was allowing Elvis Presley, the celebrity, the construction, the public figure to die, while Elvis the human being continued to live. It's a fine distinction, maybe even a rationalization, but for someone who thought deeply about spiritual matters like Elvis did, it might have been enough to make peace with the deception. Let me share one final piece of evidence that I find compelling, and then I'm going to let you make up your own mind. In 2015, a previously unknown recording surfaced at an estate sale. The recording was on a reel-to-reel tape and contained a conversation between two men discussing the operation and getting E out safely. The voices on the tape haven't been definitively identified, but voice analysis suggests one of them might be Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager and close friend. The conversation is cryptic, obviously intentionally so, but there are references to August, to the timeline, to making sure everyone plays their part, and to keeping P in the dark, presumably referring to Priscilla. The tape is dated, based on references in the conversation, to sometime in July 1977. Now, this tape could be fake, it could be about something entirely unrelated, or it could be exactly what it appears to be. A recorded planning conversation about Elvis's death hoax. The tape has been examined by audio forensic experts who say it's genuine, meaning it's not digitally created or obviously manipulated, and the recording quality and tape degradation are consistent with something recorded in the 1970s. But without being able to definitively identify the voices or verify the provenance of the tape, it remains tantalizing but not conclusive evidence.
So where does all of this leave us? After going through all of this evidence, all of these theories, all of these unanswered questions, what are we supposed to believe? Here's what I'll tell you. I can't prove that Elvis Presley faked his death. No one can. Not definitively. Not with the kind of evidence that would satisfy a court of law or convince every skeptic. But I can tell you this. The official story doesn't add up. There are too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions, too many credible witnesses reporting things that don't fit the narrative, too much evidence that's been sealed or suppressed, too many people who had motive and opportunity to orchestrate a hoax. Does that mean Elvis is alive? Almost certainly not. Even if he did fake his death in 1977, he'd most likely be dead by now from natural causes. But does it mean that what we've been told about August 16, 1977 is the complete truth? I have serious doubts, and after everything I've shared with you today, I think you should have doubts too. The truth is, we may never know what really happened. The people who knew, if there was something to know, are almost all dead now. The evidence that might prove it one way or another is locked away, sealed by court orders and family decisions and privacy laws. The Presley estate has no incentive to reveal anything that would undermine the legacy they've built, the brand they've monetized, the empire that generates hundreds of millions of dollars by keeping Elvis frozen in time as the tragic hero who died too young. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the mystery is more valuable than the truth. Maybe Elvis, wherever he is, whatever happened to him, would appreciate the fact that even in death, or alleged death, he's still got everyone talking. Still got everyone wondering, still got everyone asking questions. The king may have left the building, but he never really left our collective consciousness. And this enduring mystery is part of why Elvis Presley remains, nearly 50 years after his death or disappearance, one of the most fascinating figures in American cultural history. So what do you think? Are you convinced by the evidence, or do you think this is all just wishful thinking and coincidence? Have you had your own Elvis sighting, or do you know someone who claims to have seen him after 1977? Do you believe the official story, or do you think there's something more going on here? I want to hear from you in the comments. Let's have a real discussion about this. Share your theories, share your evidence.
Tell me what you think really happened to Elvis Presley. And if you found this deep dive interesting, if I've made you question what you thought you knew, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel reach more people who are interested in these Elvis mysteries. Make sure you're subscribed because I've got more Elvis content coming, more untold stories, more deep dives into the mysteries and controversies surrounding the King of Rock and Roll. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss anything, because trust me, we're just getting started uncovering the truth about Elvis Presley. The king may be gone, but the questions remain, and as long as there are questions, we'll be here asking them. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and remember, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. Long live the king, wherever he may be.